the two-pronged test that could put Trump in prison. As the January 6 hearings unfold, a former U.S. attorney discusses the possibility of criminally prosecuting the former president. The House Select Committee investigating the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021, has begun to hold public hearings, laying out, in explicit detail, how Donald Trump was repeatedly told by key advisors that he fairly lost the 2020 election, among other revelations. Nevertheless, Trump continued to encourage protests against the election's certification, and expressed sympathy for the view that Vice-President Mike Pence deserved to be. The biggest question hanging over the hearings is whether they will contribute to a criminal case against the former president. The Justice Department is conducting a wide-ranging investigation into January 6, but this is not the first time that Trump has appeared to be in the crosshairs of prosecutors. If the former president is charged, what exactly would the charges be, and how tough would the case be to prosecute? To talk about this, I recently spoke by phone with Barbara McQuaid, a professor at the University of Michigan Law School and a former United States Attorney for the Eastern District. She resigned from her position, which she'd held since 2010, in the early days of the Trump administration. During our conversation, which has been edited for length and clarity, we discussed why Trump's mindset is so important to any criminal case, the arguments he might make to defend himself, and whether the Justice Department is too concerned about the optics of charging a former president. If a case is made against Trump, what precisely would it be for? It would require full investigation to see if you can mount sufficient evidence, and the Justice Department will be the first to tell you that it investigates crimes and not people. But, with that in mind, it seems to me that some potential crimes here are, first, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and, second, conspiracy to obstruct an official procedure. The first one is more broad. The second one is more specific. What does that mean, conspiracy to defraud the United States? The statutory citation is Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 371. It is sometimes referred to as the Klein conspiracy, after a case named United States v. Klein. It is frequently used in cases of tax violations, but what it means is that someone with a fraudulent intent did something to obstruct or impede the official functioning of government. And so, in this instance, it would be something like, Trump and others conspired to defraud the American people and interfere with the proper transfer of presidential power. And it could be as simple as getting Mike Pence to refuse to certify the vote when he had a duty to do so. Sometimes people think about the big picture, that you have to tie Trump to the physical attack on the Capitol. And that could do it, because that was one way that the certification was obstructed. But it could also simply be his efforts to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to certify the vote. And that would be an obstruction of an official proceeding. Liz Cheney said there are 7 different schemes that they're going to try to prove in the next few weeks. It could be that they've got 7 different ways that they're going to try to show conspiracy to defraud the United States, but any one of them is enough to obtain a conviction. Alternate slates of electors, or trying to persuade Georgia to change the outcome in that one state. Any of those things could suffice for conspiracy to defraud the United States. And what about a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding? That would relate specifically to the certification effort on January 6. Again, it could be proved by a number of different methods. It could be proved by inciting the mob. That would be one way, but I think that's much harder than you need. It could be proved, again, just by pressuring Mike Pence to refuse to certify. That could be an obstruction of an official proceeding of Congress. And, by interfering with that in a way that is fraudulent, that could be a violation of that obstruction statute. There are 2 connected but separate things. The first is Trump trying to obstruct the certification of Biden as the next president. And the second is the law breaking that occurred from the mob on January 6. The mob may have been a tool to put the first scheme into effect, but there were also laws broken by the mob itself, such as invading the Capitol and assaulting police. Is your sense that the crimes we would likely see regarding Trump would be more related to the certification than the actual physical destruction of property and assault of police? Yes. I suppose the committee has dangled the latter a little bit. I still haven't seen any evidence of it, but if they could prove that someone close to Trump met with the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys on January 5th and said, "Tomorrow, I want you to breach that Capitol, and whatever happens, come hell, you must make sure that their proceeding does not continue," then you could link up the two as a conspiracy. It would still be to obstruct an official proceeding, not for the actual violence, unless you had a specific agreement, "I want you to beat up cops." You'd have to show an agreement between those specific groups. And I don't think we've seen that yet. We may never get there, but I don't think we need to, because you can just show that he was trying to get alternate slates of electors, or that he was pressuring Pence to refuse to certify, or that he was pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to find him illegal. Is there any precedent for going after politicians or office holders for these types of acts? I'm not familiar with any. The one thing that comes closest, but is probably not even the same, is a guy who was a county auditor in Cleveland who paid his opponent to run against him and deliberately lose. That's corruption in an election, but a little different from what we're talking about here. That makes me wonder whether it is actually hard to prove that these laws were broken. Well, I don't know that we have anybody who's ever tried who has this much power, the way a president does. Maybe it has been attempted at lower levels and I'm just not aware of it. I think part of it is that this is an incredibly audacious scheme, if it is proven. And it requires someone who can marshal the resources and control the levers of government to be able to pull it off the way Trump may have. But a prosecution would be for violating these broader laws rather than laws related to the functioning of elections specifically? Yes. The problem is that we get statutes on the books based on what Congress can envision. And I don't think Congress ever imagined that a president would try to do what Trump is accused of doing. And so we don't have a specific statute on the books that says, you can't pressure the vice president to abuse his authority to throw out the electors and substitute false ones, because I think no one ever imagined that. So, instead, you have things like obstructing an official proceeding or defrauding the United States out of the proper functioning of government. Those would be the closest things that would fit here. And they get used for lots of different things, but nothing like this that I've ever heard of. What would a possible defense look like here? And to what degree would it be specifically about executive power, that the president has wide latitude to conduct office as he sees? A defense that's used in most white-collar cases would probably be the one used here, which is proving intent. So, Trump said and did a lot of things, but it's because he genuinely believed he had won the election and he was the one who was trying to stop fraud. He believed Joe Biden was the one who committed fraud and he was just doing everything he was supposed to do to make sure that the will of the people was being effectuated. Maybe he was wrong in the end, but he led from a good place because he believed this was true. So proving this mindset is really hard. It's the hardest thing that happens in white-collar cases. It's the reason so many white-collar perpetrators are not held accountable, because you can't read a person's mind. But there is this concept of willful blindness, where a jury is instructed that a person cannot ignore a high probability that a fact is true just because he wishes it weren't so. So if there are enough people, as we heard at the first public hearing, telling him, "No, you lost. No, there was no fraud. There was no there. It was bullshit," at some point, most rational people are going to believe, "Oh, okay, I'm just making this up. There's no evidence." Can you talk more about intent? You're saying that you need to prove some degree of intent, but that there's also a sense that if you can prove that the person was presented with a certain amount of reasonable information, then intent isn't. Well, you have to prove intent. And it's harder in white-collar cases because people are often doing something that is not illegal, per se. If you kill somebody, that's illegal. But if what you do is paperwork, or you tell somebody something, or you send a message, or you give a speech, it's not illegal. It's only illegal if you're trying to use it to commit fraud, to perpetuate a lie, to get somebody to do something based on a misrepresentation. That's what makes it a little more difficult. You have to prove that they had that mindset, that they knew what they were saying was wrong. Even if you don't have direct evidence for that, which would really require a confession, you can still obtain a conviction because a jury is told that they should look at the totality of the circumstances and draw reasonable inferences based on their own common sense and life experience. So if someone tells you 100 times that the world is round and you think, geez, the world looks flat to me. At some point, if you continue to deny the world is round, you really know better. You are engaging in willful blindness to say the world is flat, and to sell people things on the basis that the world is flat. A jury can use inference to say, no, I think she really believed that the world was round. She was just saying it was flat because she could profit from it. So none of these defenses would be specifically about executive power, where courts have often given presidents wide latitude. I think the speech on the ellipse is one that hits the closest. The president is on duty 24/7. He gets to do what he wants to do if he believes that he's doing it as part of the duties as president. What we've seen so far is that a judge has ruled that that speech was beyond the scope of his duties, in part because he was acting as Trump the candidate and not Trump the president. But that can be tricky, whether something was in the scope of his employment or not. Nonetheless, a president still isn't allowed to commit crimes. We know the Department of Justice is looking at a lot of things that occurred on January 6, and we've also heard that a prosecutor in Georgia is looking at the Georgia angle of this. Would those be two separate cases? My guess is separate cases. Georgia is a separate sovereign from the United States, and so, if Georgia wants to charge its own case because the citizens of Georgia were victimized by some sort of fraud, then a prosecutor there can bring those charges completely apart from the Justice Department. The Justice Department, though, does have this policy that says that, generally, if a case has been brought in a state and the interests have been vindicated, the Justice Department should not double dip just to repeat a conviction. Now, sometimes a person is acquitted in the state, and so then the federal prosecution will jump in and do its own. Sometimes it is said that even though state rights were vindicated, federal rights were not. For example, in the Ahmaud Arbery case, even after the killers were convicted in state court, the feds still came in and charged them separately. It does not preclude the federal government from charging its own case, which would, I think, be a bigger, broader case. But the prosecutor in Georgia does not have to get permission from the Justice Department to do her own thing, because she is part of a separate sovereign. I was hoping you could throw a little cold water on all this, because there have been so many examples in the past 5 years of Trump not actually getting charged. I'm curious what you see as the potential pitfalls here. I think the public is not aware of just how challenging it is to put together the kind of airtight criminal prosecution that is necessary to be able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, to a jury of 12 people who must decide unanimously. Michael Sussman was just acquitted. In the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, they had a hung jury. And I think that, when we read things in the media, we listen to the phone call between Trump and Brad Raffensperger and we say, well, there it is. Done, right? We got it. And there's so much more to it than that, because you have to show the context. You have to be able to disprove the negative. Let's say Trump gets on the stand and says, well, I asked him for 11,000 votes because I believed I earned them. I believed I was asking him to correct a grave injustice, to correct the fraud that was being perpetrated. You have to prove that there was no legitimate claim that he won, and that he knew it. That requires talking to everybody that he talked to who might have given him the bad advice. It's a big task. And then, even if the Justice Department is convinced that they can obtain and sustain a conviction, that they have sufficient evidence, that is not the end of the inquiry. The next question is whether they should use their discretion to charge because it would advance a substantial federal interest. There's the legal prong, the can we charge? Question. And there's the discretionary prong, which is the should we charge? Question. Even if you think you can, should you charge a former president? Some of the things they need to think about are, what precedent does this set? Will we become a country where every new president files charges against their predecessor? That's not. What kind of distraction is this in a world where we need to pay attention to things like climate change, and a pandemic, and hostile foreign adversaries? If we are spending the next couple of years on this case, is it really in the best interest of the country? Could it result in civil unrest or even civil war? All of those questions need. On the other hand, to not hold him accountable, to not file charges, might be even worse because one of the reasons we punish people criminally is to deter them and others from doing it again in the future. And, if you don't hold them accountable, will people just keep trying to do this? I know you weren't really giving your opinion so much as giving the two sides of the argument, but one thing I have felt watching the Department of Justice, watching someone like James Comey, maybe someone like Merrick Garland, is that the desire to be seen as not political ends up manifesting itself in choices that are very political. Making a decision just based on the law is one thing. Making a decision because you're worried about the precedent this will set if a Republican is elected in 2024, or about what it's going to signal to foreign adversaries or whatever else, those decisions seem to be very political because they're not just about, in the prosecutor's mind, whether there was. Discretion is a two-edged sword. The power to use discretion is the power to be fair. The power to use discretion is also the power to discriminate. So you raise a good issue. I would point you to the Principles of Federal Prosecution, which are available online in the Justice Manual. And it talks about the need for the prosecutor to consider all of these things, but it also says certain things the prosecutor may not consider, like the person's race, religion, or gender. Politics is another one, their political association, political party, the political consequence of all of these things. While they're thinking about substantial federal interest, they can't think, does this favor Republicans or does it favor Democrats? But they can consider what the results would be on the world. Another thing they think about is protecting the mission of the department and the department's public trust. If people think that the Justice Department is simply a political actor, then it loses its legitimacy and it makes it harder for people to respect the rule of law. I do think that figures into it a little bit, even though that is a little bit political. Gee, if we charge them, it's going to look political, so we better not do it. Isn't that itself political? I think so, but it is part of the calculus. Worrying about foreign adversaries or how this is going to look to the American population is not political in the way that charging someone because they're a Democrat or Republican is political. But I do think there are political dimensions to it. And my sense is that people of a certain political stripe, probably more establishment people, are more concerned about those things you brought up. Do you have concerns about this? Yeah. I think that the Justice Department does consider institutional interests and public trust and public perception when it makes these decisions, for better or for. But, in the end, the Justice Department has to do what it thinks is right. It can't shrink from its duty just out of fear that some members of the public will accuse it of playing politics. It's like if you're the coach of a baseball team and your kid is the best player, you might be inclined to bench your kid so that everyone will praise you for how fair you are and how you play all the other kids. But, if you bench the best player just because he happens to be your kid, you're going to lose the game. Ultimately, you're there to make the best decisions. And you can't worry too much about your reputation or your place in history. Janet Reno had a saying about this. She said that, when you're making these kinds of decisions, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, so you might as well just do the right thing. When I hear people say things like, oh, The Justice Department's going to be seen as political if they go after Trump in this way. It feels almost like a dispatch from a different era of politics. That's an interesting point. Merrick Garland was in the department in the 90s. Although many things have stayed the same, I think the world is a different place. There's increased scrutiny. There's far less trust in public institutions. There is 24/7 attention. Everybody's got a megaphone with social media. There is a difference. The public isn't just going to trust you because you made the judgment and you're the Attorney General. They're going to expect you to back up your decisions and explain your decisions, and I hope he understands how that human need in America has evolved.